future of Holocaust remembrance. Again, dealing, I think in that sense, implying the fact that the people that are going to be presenting are young scholars. So they are our future in terms of remembrance, but the idea of our looking toward what will be coming in terms of Holocaust commemoration is clearly on all of our minds. One of the, but when I look back at a 40-year career at Beth David, and many of you who are on the screens today have been with me and with Beth from the beginning, and some of you more recently, but many of you from the beginning. And you can all remember with me if we go back 40 years or 30 years or 25 years, the number of Shoah survivors that were in our community, a very large number. We would have commemorative events that would take place 25, 30, 40 years ago, where there would be hundreds, in some cases maybe even thousands of survivors of the Shoah who would be there with their families, with their children, with their grandchildren. And very sadly, of course, as time marches on, those numbers have diminished substantially. And even an infant survivor of the Shoah would be late 70s. And any person who was old enough to have any remembrance of those years has to be in his or her 80s or beyond. And so that just says something in terms of the passing of time and the diminution of numbers of survivors who can share with us their stories and their messages. So up until now, and in the coming, sadly, relatively short number of years, but not for many more, it has been possible to learn what happened and to hear the stories, the recollections, and which are so often horrifying, but to have them shared directly by those who were there. Reminds us of the Agadah in the Talmud, of the discussion of the passage in Jeremiah, which speaks of the valley of bones, Emekam Atzamot, the valley of dry bones. And the prophet prophesies they're going to come back to life, and they do come back to life according to the tradition. And then, the question is asked in a later stage, Talmudic times, what happened, is that story real or was it fiction? Was it a mashal, a myth? And so Rabbi Elazar stands up and says, it was true, it really happened. And my grandfather was one of those who the prophet Ezekiel, I think I said Jeremiah, who the prophet Ezekiel revived. And here are his tefillin. He holds up his tefillin as saying he had a direct link to that miraculous event in our ancient history. So that's a very powerful motif, and that whole image in the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel is suggestive of the return of the revival of the Jewish people after a catastrophe. And so the image of somebody having a direct link is very powerful. It kind of ends the argument whether or not this really happened or whether or not it's just a myth, it's a story. I'm not going to go into the historicity of that account, but the power of that connection is incredible. And we will now, what's going to happen a generation from now, when there sadly will be no living survivors, it'll be the testimony of the children and the grandchildren of survivors who've hopefully heard their stories, and they will be able to say, my Zayde, my father, my mother, my Bubi, was at Birkenau. This is what she experienced. So there'll still be that link. Going 2 or 3 generations, that'll become more challenging. And so the ultimate question we have to ask is, how are we going to remember in a future time when the direct link is no longer there? And that's something that is of I think of concern and suggestive of how independently both programs that we're running capture the theme of the future of remembrance. But as we do in life, and in Jewish life in particular, we look toward the future by starting with the past. And how did we begin to commemorate what happened? How did we begin to remember? How did we formalize that remembrance? And what does that tell us about what we can do in the future? And that's something, again, that I think, especially at this juxtaposition in terms of history, and when we are approaching the end of the lifespan of those who survived, how do we how do we prepare for a future when there will be remembrance? One of the challenges is that what we have today, if we just look at calendar to start off with, we have numerous remembrance times for the Shoah, which personally I'm not convinced is a good thing. That when we look at 4 or 5 different occasions of the year when there are Holocaust commemorative occasions, I think it tends to take away the power of having the impact of one day a year when that remembrance would take place. And a lot of that was part of the original debate. So some of the different dates that can be used are first of all is the international date of January, January 30th, I believe, which when it's the date in which Hitler came to power, Yimach Shemo. And there's another January date of the liberation of Auschwitz, which has been observed internationally. I think it's observed by the United Nations. This week, Kristallnacht, the anniversary, the 9th of November, the anniversary of the 1938 pogrom, which in a sense was the initial action of the Shoah. And so that's observed. I mean, that's observed in our community, beginning of our Holocaust Education Week, under which this program takes place. And and then, of course, we have Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, which is this minor fast day that takes place after Hanukkah, that in a sense was used initially by the rabbinate of Israel right after the war. And in the early years, when people had it was a response to a very particular she'ela, a very particular question as to how do we mark the yurtzeit of family members that were murdered when we don't know the date. There's no date attributed to them. We don't know when they died. What do we do? What date do we use? And so the suggestion was made by the Israeli rabbinate at the time, and it was adopted by many, that the 10th of Tevet should become the day in which we remember those who were murdered. And the yurtzeit of those where there's no fixed date would be on the 10th of Tevet. By the way, the late Rabbi Pappenheim of blessed memory observed for his parents who were murdered the 10th of Tevet as the yurtzeit. And many others of that, did at that time. That was the date that would be observed. It gave so it became in a sense a Holocaust Memorial Day, but specifically to remember to a yurtzeit day for those who had no yurtzeit. People on their own chose to, and in our shul we had every year to this day, if you're in shul mincha on Yom Kippur, and Michael Rubin does the male for the yurtzeits, it goes on for 5 minutes because a lot of people chose Yom Kippur to observe those yurtzeits. And we had the pressure in earlier years that everybody who had a yurtzeit in Yom Kippur wanted an aliyah. And I remember Rabbi Pappenheim trying to argue with them, or to say nicely, that it wasn't really the yurtzeit. In other words, you're observing Yom Kippur as the yurtzeit, but we can't give 300 people a year. But that became popular as well. Because it's a great day to observe a yurtzeit. But I think the idea of the rabbinate was better to take the 10th of Tevet, which in many cases, and has been used as the yurtzeit day for that very, very specific reason of when do you observe a yurtzeit and when you have no idea when the death took place. Sometimes people did know when the death, but that was kind of rare, and most people didn't. And you chose a date, and so that was another aspect of Holocaust remembrance. And another but the question came up in the 1950s in Israel, where again you had a very significant number of survivors who settled, and a lot of the key decisions were going to be made there. And the Jewish world looked to Israel, to the very young Knesset at the time, to help in those deliberations. So one of the interesting developments in I think 1950 was a decision by, or a desire by primarily secular Israeli leaders to designate the 19th of April, the English calendar date, as the Holocaust Memorial Day, what would later be called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the day of remembrance of the Shoah and heroism. That was the 19th of April was the choice. Why? Because that was the day of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. So following the English calendar date. So what was the problem with that date? The problem with that date was that it often conflicted with Pesach. And because you're going to be using an English calendar date, a Gregorian calendar date, and it's going to go different places in terms of when Pesach is. So it wasn't considered appropriate to, during Passover, have a Memorial Day. So the compromise was reached that Yom HaShoah would be basically the week following Pesach, and it would follow on a Hebrew calendar, and that, so that became the 27th of Nisan, and that again prevented it from conflicting with Pesach. There are still to this day many in the Orthodox world who do not accept Yom HaShoah because it follows during a period when we don't say Tachanun, we don't say penitential prayers, because the whole month of Nisan takes on a kind of festive mode, and we try to avoid overt mourning, and technically you're not only allowed to eulogize then. I mean, most rabbis do, the old eulogy. I'm not going to eulogize today, but I'm going to say a few words, and 20 minutes later. So that was, for some reason, a reason to object that you can't have a Memorial Day during the entire month of Nisan. But I think most of the Jewish world, including the liberal Orthodox Jewish world, was content with accepting that as a compromise, that we want to recognize the impact of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was the first significant civilian revolt against the Nazis in all of occupied Europe. These poor, starving Jewish inhabitants of the ghetto, armed with a few pistols. They held off the Germans for a rather long period of time in an incredibly heroic battle that was ultimately not going to succeed, but it did succeed in creating this spark of heroism that really inspired much of the world, and certainly the Jewish world, forever. So we like the idea of connecting it to that event, the Memorial Day. And again, the name of the official name of Yom HaShoah also incorporates V'Hagvura, and also a day of heroism, remembering those who were heroic. And that in itself kind of had its own controversy, because are we going to highlight the Jews that were fought in a battle as opposed to those Nebuch Poor Yidden that were unable to fight back? But that's another story. So Yom HaShoah then becomes the official day designated by the Knesset, still not accepted by the right wing of Orthodoxy. And I'll tell you that just a couple of years ago, the RCA, which is the centrist or modern Orthodox rabbinic group, which is the most moderate. The word liberal I won't use because they wouldn't like me to use the word liberal, but the more moderate of voices of Orthodoxy, produced a beautiful new Siddur, which I have a copy in the shul, a beautiful Siddur that is it's magnificent, and it's just with the translations, with the explanations, the Hebrew finds this really a beautiful Siddur. But I was really disappointed that rather than have, and they recognize Yom HaAtzmaut, which is pretty revolutionary for an Orthodox Siddur, because Art Scroll doesn't recognize the state of Israel, for example. So there's no Yom HaAtzmaut in Art Scroll. But there is a significant recognition of Israel, of Yom HaAtzmaut, celebration rituals for Yom HaAtzmaut, etc. But for Yom HaShoah, they don't call it Yom HaShoah. They just say readings about the Holocaust. And then there's an explanation because of the controversy of people who feel that you shouldn't be remembering the Holocaust during the month of Nisan. So that disappointed me. And that's again but nonetheless, most of the Jewish world has accepted Yom HaShoah as a primary day of commemoration. And my wish would be that that would become the day of our focus, rather than dividing into 4 or 5 different dates during this year, which ends up diluting commemoration. But that's just my bias, and I don't carry a lot of authority in these matters. But it kind of indicates that the first priority, I think, in terms of remembering, if we go back to the past, remembering the Shoah, came from it came from looking for a date, a time to commemorate, to remember. In other words, to find an occasion when we would gather together in order to remember, and to remember together. And again, for up until now, for these past close to 75 years, we have that has been in the presence of those who survived, which has given tremendous power to those commemorations. And we've done commemorations that, when we've, traditionally, and even the community commemorations to this day, when they're not virtual, as like this year, have involved, survivors who would be lighting memorial candles as part of the service, and in some cases telling their stories again. And again, that's sadly going to have a limited lifespan in the coming years, but that's been something of incredible power at this point. Another aspect of remembrance, as you all know, has been the proliferation of memoirs. I'm now in the process of contemplating the distribution of my library, much of which, if not most of which, I will not be able to keep after I retire. And I have about 400 books on the Holocaust, and I'm figuring out what, to what institution could I donate that when nobody wants books anymore. But many of them are memoirs, individual memoirs of written by survivors. I mean, some are either different, the great gradations and qualities. Some of them are incredibly beautifully written. Not all of them. Not everybody is a great writer. My sense is, in terms of knowing where books are this day in the world, in terms of the future, I don't know how many. I think that it's very important that these become written, but a lot of them end up really being legacies of the family of those survivors, and don't have wide international readerships. Except not everybody's an Elie Wiesel or people of who have millions of readers. That's just a very small number who penetrate the marketplace and really manage. So that will. I'm not sure that's going to be a major source of long-term remembrance. So we also have, I think now it's 55,000 recordings made by the Spielberg Foundation, where people did the video, and a lot of you will know your family members did it. And I haven't checked the screen close enough to see if any of you did it, but we have, that was something that, was very successful. I believe they're all online at this point. In truth, I'm not sure how often they're watched. In other words, they're recorded, and I think it's great that they're recorded, but how long, how far is that going to go in terms of telling the story of what happened? Because again, sometimes it's great to have the numbers, but when there were so many, people are going to go in 55,000 recordings, unless it's your family member or somebody, I don't know how widespread, that, but again, it is amazing when you have that power. When I would say my future father-in-law, but he passed away, so he won't be. He would have been my father-in-law. When he passed away suddenly 11 years ago, he had recorded. It wasn't through Spielberg, but he had done a radio recording. It was on 3 cassettes. I think it's the last time I've ever listened to a cassette recording, because I don't have anything to play cassettes with anymore. But he recorded 3 cassettes. He had a radio interview, or a series of radio interviews on his experiences during the Shoah, and talking as a survivor. I was the first person to listen to those recordings, because the night that he passed away, I was going to be eulogizing him the next day, and I'd only met him a couple of times. I didn't really know him. So I wanted to know his story, and it was just incredibly powerful for me to learn, his name was Marshall Korn, to learn his story and to hear it, in a very graphic sense of what he went through. And so these recordings are very important. And at some point there is a place for them. But in terms of widespread commemoration, I'm not sure to what effect that has. So I want to spend a bit of time on something that we did, and many of you are familiar with it. And I want to go into the background of what we did, which was 18 years ago. Well, we began the process 25 years ago, but 18 years ago, we created Megillat HaShoah, and which was published by the Rabbinical Assembly and the Schechter Institute, and now exists in multiple translations, has been prominently read in Israel and community centers, and it's had it hasn't taken off to the extent we would have liked, but it has continued to be read. We did a virtual reading this year with, I think close to 300 participants, and we had worldwide people participating. We had people reading part of it in Spanish, in French, and of course in Hebrew and in English. So it's something that I take pride in, but I want to go into how we came to that. And by the way, after that, I will pause for you to comment or question. But I want to give you some background in terms of what brought us to the point of creating Megillat HaShoah, and that story begins. Basically in I would say in 1995, approximately 25 years ago. We have I should have been recording this. Oh yeah, it is recording. Oh, Corey, you're wonderful. Because I want to give Alex Eisen a copy of this, because I'm going to talk about him, and he's not that good about Zooming, but I want to send him the recording after. We have a member who most of you, if not all of you, know and love, Alex Eisen, 92 years old now. Obviously a survivor of the Shoah, who had a passion. He had a burning desire, and he spoke to me several times about something. And it was about, he said, Rabbi, if we're going to remember the Shoah, if we're going to remember the Holocaust, how come we don't have a ritual? It's one thing, it's nice to have survivors speak about their experiences. I'm a survivor. I know how powerful that is. It's very painful for many of the survivors to speak, but it's so important for that message to be heard. But he said, we're not going to be here forever. What's going to happen 50 years from now or beyond? None of us are going to be here. We're not going to have survivors speak. Are we just going to then move on and forget about it? At a time when people want to deny the Shoah, they want to say it never happened. What are we going to do? So he came up with the idea of creating a Megillah that would be read in synagogue. Just like Purim, we read Esther. Read on the other festivals, we read other Megillot. We read about something in Purim, we read about something that historians say probably never happened. It's a folk tale. Maybe it happened, thousands of years ago. It's a lovely story, but it's not, And he said, look, and even we have Pesach every year where we remember enslavement in Egypt thousands of years ago. It's not something that we necessarily relate to directly, indirectly through our tradition and our text. But we have this book that we read every year, Haggadah. And that brings us together. We should also have something, he said, to read on Yom HaShoah that would bring us together. And that would be a standardized practice that Jews all over the world could be doing. So he mentioned this to me. I think it's a great idea. And, but, he wasn't prepared. That wasn't enough. And he tried to sell his vision in the Orthodox world. He's very well connected. So he was in Israel and he had a meeting with Rav Lau, who then was the chief rabbi, the father of the current Ashkenazi chief rabbi. And he met with Rav Lau and he told him about his idea. And Rav Lau said, in Yiddish, ich halte nicht von Yom HaShoah. He said, I don't hold by Yom HaShoah. And he gave him the ultra-Orthodox line that it's during Nisan and you can't. So Alex was not impressed. He was not a happy camper. And that disillusioned him from Rabbi Lau from that point onward. He also had done some fundraising for Bar Ilan University, an Orthodox university in Israel. And so he talked to the leadership of Bar Ilan. They connected him with one of the rabbis who was very involved in Israel in Bar Ilan. And they listened to him because they needed his fundraising. They came back to him months later and said, no, we can't do this. It's like too audacious. It's not something that we're going to do. So he was nudging me about this for a long time. So I said, you know what, let me talk to my colleagues in the Rabbinical Assembly. And we also spoke to Rabbi Golinkin, who many of us remember as being our second rabbi on the holidays for 36, 37 years. This was the first year he wasn't here. And he also happened to stay very often at Alex's home. Alex would host him, so they became friendly. And so I brought David Golinkin into the picture, and that began the creation process of Megillat HaShoah. And it was a 3 or 4 year process. We first, something that very few people know, we had a committee in Israel that Rabbi Golinkin chaired that was in charge with writing the Megillah. And then I chaired a committee, but it was a one-person committee, the best kind of committee, that was in charge with putting together the booklet, like editing the booklet, that including other readings and tefillot, etc. So we got this in motion, but the first thing we did was, who's going to write? We were going to commission somebody to write the Megillah. And we approached Aaron Appelfeld, alav shalom, one of Israel's leading novelists and a survivor of the Holocaust. One of the internationally recognized brilliant writer. And so he wrote. We paid a lot of money. He wrote a Megillah. He wrote what he was presenting as what could have been Megillat HaShoah. And we had said that we wanted something in 6 chapters, but we didn't give a lot of other instruction. And what he wrote was beautiful, but totally inappropriate. Was not something that it was a story. Again, he was a great writer, so it's a great story, but it was not appropriate to our purposes. It was not something that was synagogue friendly. So we had to reject, and we gave it back to him. I don't think he published it, but it was good, but it was not suitable. So we tried to go really high. It's like going again, the top, top fiction writer in Israel, who's a survivor. So no one is more credentialed, but it didn't work. So the committee basically began to process in Israel who's going to write it. And Avigdor Shinan, who's a scholar in Talmud and Midrash, was on the committee, and he just one night went home and wrote it. And just wrote it in this burst of inspiration. They went through a few editing, we went through some revision, but basically that's what created the Megillah. But I want to actually look at a couple of texts before I open up to any questions or discussion. And I'm going to share a screen here. And I want to just highlight a couple of quotations from Rabbi Golinkin's introduction. And I may show something from my introduction that appears in the front of the book. But this is a really good introduction to the importance of this kind of commemoration. And so this is the beginning of Rabbi Golinkin's piece. The Jewish people is an Am Olam, an eternal people with a historic memory, thousands of years old. It has always succeeded in commemorating major historic events with the aid of religious rituals. And we have a quotation here, which is actually, it's not cited properly here. I just noticed it was actually written by the former chief rabbi of the British Empire. I'm just having a senior moment and blanking on his name. It'll come to me in a moment. But he wrote in a couple of Haggadot, this appears, this beautiful citation. About 300 years ago, a ship named the Mayflower set sail for the New World. It was an important event in the annals of England and America. Yet I wonder if there is even one Englishman who knows exactly when that ship set sail, How many Americans know how many people were on that ship? What type of bread did they eat when they left England? Yet more than 3,300 years later, before the Mayflower set sail, the Jews left Egypt, and every Jew in the world, even in American Soviet Russia, knows exactly on which day they left, the 15th of Nisan. Everyone knows what kind of bread they ate, matzah, and until today, Jews all over the world eat matzah on the 15th of Nisan, and they recount the Exodus. So in other words, Ben Gurion emphasized that on Pesach, we remember the Exodus by a religious act, the Seder, in order to remember and relive the Exodus once a year. As a result, every Jew in the world is well versed in this seminal episode in the history of our people, and connects it to a Talmudic statement in Bava Batra, reminding us other ways of commemorating the destruction of the temple, which is one of the major events that we felt needed commemoration in our early history. Sages said, one who plasters his house and leaves a little bare, a man prepares a festive meal and leaves one small portion. A woman puts on all her jewelry and leaves off one small item. As it is written, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, if I do not keep Jerusalem in mind, even at my happiest hour. So basically that we do symbolic, but actual actions in order to remember. And so that's he's building up the case in a sense here for creating a Megillah that would be read to create something tangible that could be a reminder of what happened long ago, but that will be part of our history. And if you get a copy of Megillat HaShoah, and it's even available online, I can direct you how you get that at some point. You can read his entire introduction, which is I think it's wonderful. And then he talks about the various Megillot that were commemorated in order to remember tragedies. Of course, Eicha, the Book of Lamentations, biblical book, destruction of the first temple, liturgical poems commemorating earthquake in the year 749. I wonder if there'll be liturgy that will commemorate the pandemic, COVID-19. There already were a couple of attempts, but nothing that's going to be earth-shattering, but that could happen. Blood libel of 1117, commemorated liturgy. And you see other examples of various things that were commemorated. And then he talks about how people advocated creating a Megillah for Yom HaShoah, or for remembering the Holocaust, not specifically for Yom HaShoah, including a Meir Amsel, a Haredi rabbi and a survivor, writing that there should be a Megillah that would be created like the scroll of Eicha. That would basically be what we did. He didn't do it, but we're the ones who did it. We created a Megillah that would be read on Yom HaShoah. So that is, again, I think part of the power of what we in our congregation did in order to do something tangible, something specific that would become a familiar way of ritualizing an event when there would not be people necessarily to remind us directly of what happened. I mean, even so, that's that's where this comes down to. These are my words now that I'm quoting. Loss of memory is scary whenever and to whomever it occurs, but to Jews in particular, the Jews of our times, it is terrifying. We have a great deal to remember, including memories that the rest of the world would rather see forgotten. We fear for ourselves when we realize that each year to come means fewer survivors of the Holocaust left to remind us and the world of what happened, of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. We fear for the millions who will be wiped out of all earthly record, if not for our determined effort to ensure that they are remembered and revered until the end of time. You know that the memories of the previous generation, which the next generation carries into the future, are imperfect at best. They are a mere echo of the events, times, feelings, and conditions described. This is all the more reason for us to listen as well as we can to the witnesses of events that preceded us for the next generation. It's our testimony, 1, 2, or 10 generations removed from actual events, that will help set the tone of the Jewish future. And I talk about Alex Eisen and his contribution to this effort, and how it really began in our congregation. The very first reading, by the way, was almost exactly 18 years ago. that when we inaugurated Megillat HaShoah, and we had, and some of you must have been there, 18 years ago. It was in 2002, November 2002, during Holocaust Education Week. So it would have been almost exactly the time we're sitting in right now. And we had, I think, about 1,300 people in shul. We set up kol nidre seating right to the back. And Alex had the brilliant idea for the first several years that we did this, not just this first reading, of requiring tickets. We said, no, we wouldn't need to bother with tickets. He says, no, you have to have tickets. And that was what motivated us to actually put seat numbers in our rows. We have seat numbers, which we didn't always have. So people could have row G, 7, and 8, and there would be numbers on the seats. And we had a packed house. And the first several times that we did the reading, again, well over 1,000 people, representing the entire community. We had Orthodox, Reform, Conservative. We had, and that was the initial reading 18 years ago. And in the first several years, we also had much larger numbers. It began to diminish, in subsequent years, unfortunately, and that's something that we've seen in all commemoration. It's another subject that needs to be talked about. But I still remember that event 18 years ago, which was before the book was actually printed. It was only in manuscript form at that time. And the next Yom HaShoah in the spring, we had another reading, and we brought in Avigdor Shinan, who was the author, who spoke to us. And ironically, that took place, the first Yom HaShoah reading after the inauguration reading at this time of the year, took place during SARS. Remember SARS? And Avigdor Shinan's wife did want him to travel to Toronto because Toronto was a hotbed of SARS. But he came and he said it was the best decision he ever made. He told his wife, it's a good thing I didn't listen to you, because I had the most amazing experience when my Megillah was read in front of over 1,000 people at Beth David. And he always remembers that event of the introduction of the Megillah to the community. So that's, again, one of the things that we've done. And I'm proud and happy to tell the story of the creation, but it was for a very specific reason. It was trying to create a mechanism for future remembrance of the Shoah. In other words, how do we take what we want to convey into a post-survivor world? And how do we create ritual that will be able to be something that becomes part of who we are, just like we read the Megillah of Esther and Purim, just like we read the Haggadah at a Seder, in which we take history and make it live. We need to make this history live, because the world can't afford to forget what happened to us, and we can't allow ourselves to forget or to, in any way, not cherish the memory of those who died, those who were murdered, and of those who heroically fought to create a Jewish presence in the world. So I'm going to now go on pause. I've been going on for a long time. I'm going to figure if I can figure out, maybe Corey, you can help me. How can I unmute everybody? How do I do that? Okay, Corey will help me, because I can only see how to, but I will ask those anyone who wants to ask a question or comment, please to so indicate. Okay, David, let me. We have to ask you to unmute, and you have to unmute yourself now. Okay, yeah, perfect.